So let me just check if YouTube it's on. Give me 1 second. Videos. Shouldn't be in live. There we go. Perfect. Estamos oficialmente en vivo. Voy a hacer la introducción en español para mi querido, hermoso y altamente sensual y desechable capital humano. Hoy tengo invitado a mi amigo Eddie Liger, parte del Midwestern Marx Institute. Hemos hecho otros videos antes y hoy lo invité a que hagamos un review de noticias en inglés. Entonces, para la gente que no habla inglés, no se preocupen. YouTube tiene la función de poner los subtítulos abajo para que puedan traducir. Entonces, voy a cambiar a inglés. Eddie, my friend, so nice to have you here. How are you, man?
I'm good. Thanks so much. I'm excited.
Awesome, dude. You know, like I always start these new reviews by reminding people, like with the same logo I have on the corner, that we're all like very beautiful, very sexy, very hot, but very, very disposable human resource. It's like my retake, like my reinterpretation on the proletariat and class consciousness. But now, since the capitalists embrace the terminology of human capital, then I plan to revert it and subvert the terminology of human capital and remind people that under capitalism, we cannot aspire to be truly human. The most we can aspire to is to be human capital.
Absolutely. It's a perfect slogan. It's perfect that the capitalists have embraced that too, because that's how they see us.
Yeah, exactly. It's important for us to be aware of that nomenclature. So jumping right ahead into the news, I've been away for a couple of weeks now. Like I told you already, I was in Iceland with my wife for a small vacation, but a lot of stuff happened. I think one of the big ones that we're going to discuss this week is the UN meeting that took place in the US, in New York. And a lot of very important and prominent figures of international geopolitics had interesting interventions, and the speeches were interesting to say, and I will say Lula had a very important participation, Zelensky as well, but in a very different direction. I love the participation of Latin American presidents like Petro, like the Bolivian president. A lot of presidents were very interesting in their participations, and we're going to go through them. But first one, and I think probably the most impactful news of the last few days, is what happened in Canada. So if you would like us to brief us into what happened into the Canadian Parliament, that would be a nice place to start.
For sure, yeah. Basically, they had Zelensky in their parliament, and they wanted to honor somebody who fought for Ukrainian freedom, is the way they pitched it during World War II. But of course, the Ukrainian nationalists during World War II sided with the Axis powers, with Hitler. So what they were applauding was somebody who fought alongside the SS. And Trudeau has since come out and apologized, but it's incredible. And, after World War II, a lot of Nazis were filtered into Western governments, a lot of fascists. And now we're seeing similar things happen with US-backed fascists abroad. So
it's crazy. So to begin with, what was the context of the round of applause? It was a visit from Zelensky to the Canadian Parliament. He was asking for money, I can tell.
Yes, yeah. Of course.
And then after that, what was Trudeau's excuse? Like, how did he ask for forgiveness? He didn't he didn't do background research. He had no way to connect the fact that this guy was fighting against communists in World War II, which is a very obvious conclusion to make.
Yeah, he said it was a mistake and then tried to place the blame on the speaker at the time and take it off himself. But yeah, and then he apologized to the Canadian Jewish community, which makes sense. But
right. So, well, a very, very embarrassing moment for the Canadian Parliament at this time, for Trudeau as part of the Liberal Party in Canada. But let's go into detail, Eddie. So what do you think this represents in terms of the current role of a fascist ideology in the West? Because I don't think we can take this as an isolated event. We have to take it into context. And this is not new. Like, the fact is that in Canada, they applauded Zelensky and a former military personnel that was in line or completely aligned with the Nazi during World War II. And this is not the first time that Zelensky has been applauded. Where else has Zelensky been applauded? And what does this imply out of the alignment of the West currently in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia?
Yeah, Zelensky's been applauded in the U.S. The White House has hosted members of the Azov Battalion, which is a Banderite organization, sort of paramilitary organization that after the 2014 coup in Ukraine was brought into the Ukrainian National Guard and became part of the Ukrainian military. And I mean, we know that after World War II, a lot of fascists were filtered into Western governments or took refuge in the West. And there were a lot of Nazi scientists who ended up working for NASA. And now we're seeing something similar with the Western-backed fascists in Ukraine, where, you know, there's all these fascists now being honored in the US, being honored in Canada, which they're portraying as, you know, we're just clapping for Ukraine. We're just fighting for Ukrainian independence. But of course, the West has been backing fascists in Ukraine since the beginning to push their own interests.
Yeah, as always, no? Typically, if a guy presents himself as anti-communist, you can already tell he's a fascist. He's just waiting for the right time to come out. But normally, anti-communist is synonym with fascism. Another thing that is interesting here is that reminds me of Lenin, you know, like fascism, the higher stage of capitalism, or let's say this is capitalism. When it turns into defensive mode, it becomes fascist. Like the liberals will prefer to side with the fascists in defense of market economies, always before siding with the proletariat, so with siding with the workers. And I think this is a perfect example of how, in the end, beyond this debate between left and right in the US and in Canada, which I think is very much misunderstood because of historical conditions, I think it's important for people to remember that even Republicans and liberals in the US, or Republicans and Democrats in the US, they are liberal. In the end, their ideology is liberal. So they will always partner with whatever is providing, even if by force, the means necessary for the perdurance and endurance of the free market before seizing any ground to the proletariat and to improving the quality of life of workers, or moving to the historical social process of becoming a socialist country. They will always prefer more bellical, more violent, and more extreme, let's say, solutions, as we are seeing today.
Absolutely. It's nothing new historically. I mean, some people will pretend like it's an absurd prospect when you say the US is backing Nazis, or the Western powers are backing Nazis or fascists in Ukraine. But I mean, what do you think the Contras were in Nicaragua when the Sandinistas looked like they were going to get rid of capitalism and put a socialist government in power? The US funneled arms and weapons into the Contras. Pinochet in Chile. I mean, the examples of the US backing fascism when it looked like a socialist revolution or uprising was coming about, they're endless.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this sets a very interesting precedent, because, you know, like, what was impressive for me was the monumental round of applause. And you see people, and I was researching some of the people that were on the audience in the Canadian Parliament, and some of them are actually historians. So one thing that is very important for people to remember here is that they know exactly what they're applauding. This is not a mistake by any extent of the world. That, like, this is what we have to keep in mind. They cannot claim ignorance in these situations. Whoever fought against the Soviets in World War II were siding with the Nazis. This is clear, simple, and very straightforward. And the second thing is that they know historically exactly what they are supporting. This is perfectly aligned with their interests, and in the end, whatever stands in the way into the motives and the intentions of capital, that they will do aside. Even if they will have to do momentarily away with personal freedoms, they will do so, and they will impose higher stages of violence and authoritarian governments, as long as they can protect private property.
Absolutely. It's a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. The state is a tool of class suppression, and it makes sense that as the working class gets more organized, the state gets more repressive.
Yeah, and also makes sense in a way that even if we can say that the Anglo-capitalist hegemony, it's getting into a conundrum because of the growth of China and the alternative multilateral force of BRICS, they will get more violent. And this is them embracing their more violent arm, to say. Like, they will let fascism do the dirty work that capitalism cannot be, let's say, portrayed as the one doing.
Absolutely. Right. You see them trying to apologize for this and say, no, we didn't mean to support Nazis. But as you said, there are historians in the parliament. They knew what they were doing. Yeah.
It's incredible. And they will keep funding it, which is amazing. So let's go to the second one. And I think this one is very, very close to home. And when I mean close to home, close to the US and close to Mexico, I think everybody now is paying attention to the ongoing and the preparation of the next cycle of elections in the US between, most likely, current President Biden, former President Trump, and also some side candidates, which I think I would like to get your opinion on as well, like Cordell West, which I think it's interesting that we have on the run. So can you give us like a brief recap of what's currently going on in the situation in the US?
Yeah, we got an election coming up, obviously, and in the Republican primary, Trump is leading heavily. It looks like the nomination is all but wrapped up for him.
Yeah.
Um, whereas Joe Biden actually has a couple interesting challengers in the Democratic primary. There's one named Marianne Williamson, who's to the left of Biden, advocating for health care, and a very similar candidate to Bernie Sanders, but without the mass support behind her. And then RFK, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the nephew of
True.
John F. Kennedy, yeah, who's really critical of Joe Biden, and he's getting decent support. And then you have a third party candidate, Cornel West, who's around 4 or 5% in the polls right now, who's running third party on a platform of anti-imperialism and socialism explicitly. So it's very interesting. But if I had to guess, I would say right now it looks like the election is leaning towards Trump. And a poll just came out that showed him leading Biden
10 points,
by
right?
about 10 points.
Yeah. I saw that. So we have a very strong possibility of Trump actually coming back after his hiatus, and he went into the time chamber to train, I guess, something like Goku from Dragon Ball, and now he's back fully loaded and ready for war. Like, what does it mean? Like, he's asking for plans to attack Mexico. What's your take on this?
I mean, it's sad to see, because he was starting his campaign by saying we need to end the proxy war in Ukraine. We need to end the wars. But I mean, that's what he said in his last campaign too. And then he put in his cabinet John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, and was getting advised from Elliot Abrams, these guys who were architects of the Iraq War and other horrific regime change interventions, just arch neocons. So a lot of people had hope that Trump was going to at least frame himself as the anti-imperialist candidate, which maybe he still is in the case of the proxy war. But then he comes out with this absurd plan to invade Mexico, supposedly, and to bomb Mexico, which Fox News is also pushing right now, which is a Republican outlet in the U.S. And this isn't something that the Democratic Party is even talking about. So it's almost like Trump going out of his way to push for another war, and it kind of pokes holes in the idea that Trump is an anti-imperialist, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. Do you think this is another rhetoric tool like the wall was in his first campaign? You know, like, he was very recurrent about this idea of building the wall, or it was his motto, like, build a wall, build a wall, build a wall, because probably in the last cycle, the loss of jobs and the current wave of migrants and the insecurity, everything was pinned on the migrants. So it was an easy populist win for him to say build a wall. And now probably like the main concern is the fentanyl addiction, the drug problems on the street. So he's pinning the drug problem in Mexico and using this as his excuse. Do you think is related somehow?
Absolutely. I mean, really, the crisis in America was created by the pharmaceutical companies, who we know created the opioid crisis and lied. So it's so easy to scapegoat immigrants. And you never hear American politicians say, yeah, there's a lot of refugees and immigrants coming into America, let's stop sanctioning other countries, let's stop bombing other countries. Their solution is always build a giant wall or a new war, which is, imagine how many new immigrants and refugees a US-led war against Mexico would cause.
Yeah, it's crazy to imagine, right? Like, instead of addressing the root cause of the problem, they just talk about the symptoms and come up with populist, dumb marketing like solutions for the problem. And don't you agree? Also, there's some slight fascist rhetoric implied of this constant use of the other as an imaginary enemy that is the one to blame for our problems. And what do you think is Trump's fixation with Mexico? Just the fact that it's close enough that people can relate? Like, why do you think he scapegoats Mexico all the time?
Yeah, I think it's just become a xenophobic trope that really began with Fox News and was probably thought up by some right-wing or Republican think tanks at some point. But I mean, that's just always been a thing in America since I was young, is people talk about a problem with immigration and they always jump to Mexico. I think it's just because they're at our southern border. So I think Trump is just trying to capitalize on a xenophobic trope that's existed within the U.S. for a long time.
Yeah, it is true that it's very dominant. And what is the relationship between the fact that, in a way, Republicans have lately built this rhetoric that the Democrats were actually the warmongers. Like if you see historically, Democrats have started so many wars. I think Obama is the negative Nobel Prize winner in terms of most invasions and most bomb drops everywhere. Like the guy was truly a nightmare. But then you see other presidents, and mostly like the Republicans, they follow up on wars. They're probably more, let's say, less visible about their warmongering. They do, of course, they outside of the ropes, they go and they make business with all the big military infrastructure companies and whatnot. But they tend to start less wars. So it's interesting for me that Trump now is running on the idea of starting a new war, like substituting a proxy war for a new war. And also, like I want you to read on the implication on the cost of this, because Machiavelli was the one to say, and also Sun Tzu in Art of War, that in a way the public approval of wars is very important, because it speaks back to how the politicians are using public money, and this can highly damage them.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because Trump, when he first ran back in 2016, contrasted himself to George Bush and the neoconservative Republicans who started the war with Iraq and Afghanistan, which, many people interpreted as sort of an anti-imperialist turn for Trump and the party himself. And there are a lot of young Republicans in America who are isolationists. They don't think that we should be involved. So to see him advocating a war against Mexico and using all the same tropes that they used to lie us into the war in Iraq, like it'll be a quick war, it'll only take a few minutes, like it's all the same crap that they said about Iraq, and we're still there 20 years later, of course. But I don't know what's driving it. It's certainly some, like Lindsey Graham has said this, Greg Gutfeld of Fox News has said this. It's definitely a thing within the Republican Party. Why Trump is jumping on board with it, I don't know yet. Maybe just because it fits in with his xenophobic, anti-Mexican rhetoric, but it's terrible and scary to see, especially because he might win.
And finally, could it be related to his sponsors in any way? Because in a way, like every politician needs to be endorsed and sponsored to run a campaign, and campaigns can be very expensive. So, and then again, the proxy war on Ukraine is great business for the U.S. It's a pity to say, but it's absolutely great business in a moment where the U.S. is struggling because it's losing productivity. It's not investing into developing their productive forces. It's not developing in innovation. They already lost against China in the number of patents per year. So the U.S. has been losing fast their ground on being the most productive and advanced and innovative country on earth. But in a way, they keep being very competitive business-wise with the power of the dollar, also because it's backed by all these arm industry and the military complex, industrial complex behind. So do you think, in a way, he is just responding to his sponsors or speaking the will of his sponsors? Could it be?
I think for sure. I know he heavily funded his first campaign himself, but he does have more donors this time around. And something that you said in the last stream we did together that I've repeated many times is that the U.S., since Citizens United was passed, which basically legalized political bribery, has basically been like an ANCAP society, where these politicians, like the bills they put forward are written by lobbyists. Everything they do is something that's being pushed by their donors, which, are the ruling capitalist class. So I don't know exactly which donors Trump has that would be pushing for something like this, but I'd say that's a really good bet if you follow the money. That's probably why he is.
Yeah, that's a good take. I didn't thought about the fact that on the first term he funded his own campaign and he was already a media celebrity, so he capitalized on his fame. But now this second term he's actually getting money, so that means most of his politics won't be his own politics in a way. He's probably going to be more instrumentalized into the will of the sponsors than acting on his own ideology or intentions or whatnot.
Absolutely.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so let's see. That's also very interesting for Mexico as well, since we have coming elections in Mexico as well, and we have now we're coming to more stable candidates to what we're going to see in the next cycle, which is going to be decided very soon. And I think Mexican candidates already need to be prepared into how to address and how to position themselves, because the relationship between Mexico and the U.S. is very much symbiotic, especially for Mexico. Mexico is heavily dependent on whatever the U.S. does and how the U.S. economy behaves. And if we have Trump in power for the next term, then whoever is the next Mexican president needs to be completely prepared to what will come. Either siding with BRICS, which is going to be a nightmare because we're too close to the US. That will, you see, I was thinking about this the other day. if Mexico sides with BRICS, it's like Ukraine siding with NATO. Right?
Right.
Like in the sense of it's too close to home.
It's gonna put a target on their back, right?
Exactly, it's putting a target on their back. It's too close to home in the sense like if Mexico becomes aligned with BRIC, the US is going to take it as an aggression. It's going to take it as direct violence, and that's going to be very, very dangerous for Mexico.
For sure. I mean, maybe that's what this is about. Maybe they just see Mexico forging, and Trump, especially since the American deep state and legal system has been targeting Trump to try and knock him out of the next election, or at least the Democrats have been. Trump has been ratcheting up the anti-China rhetoric, which is, I think, him kind of appealing to the deep state, saying, get off my back. I'm still going to do your bidding somewhat. So it makes sense. He wouldn't want Mexico joining BRICS.
Yeah, so we'll see. That game is going to be a definite game for the next few years. Let's see how it goes. So the next news was probably my favorite of the week. We had this encounter at the UN in New York, and a lot of presidents were giving very inspiring speeches, speaking truth to power in some sense, reminding us of the participation of probably some Asian leaders, but also Fidel and like the participation of Castro in the UN. Like it reminded me a little bit of those speeches of those days, where we had more hopes and dreams for alternative modes of governance and alternative modes of organizing power multilaterally. So it was a very inspiring week at the UN. And I agree with you, and you were the one to send me this news that one of the most inspiring was given by Lula, the current president of Brazil. And already, just to give people a frame of reference, even if Brazil is coming out of a proto-fascist government from President Jair Bolsonaro, Brazil has always had a very, very strong diplomatic branch, which is Itamaraty. Itamaraty is like the diplomatic arm of the Brazilian government. They have used and they have had a very strong independence, regardless of the current ongoing president. And that diplomatic excellence is still reflected in what we're seeing today with Lula. So I was very happy with the speech. Also important to remember that Lula was in jail. He was unjustly put in jail by Lava Jato, which was a major intervention by the CIA in Brazil to take the leftists from power and give rise to Bolsonaro and proto-fascism. But one of the things that was very interesting is that Lula got out of jail with a very strong sense of national importance and national, let's say, independence. He really came out with strong, absolute metaphysical concepts of the importance of developing productive forces, strengthening the borders, defending the Amazon, setting himself up again in geopolitics with a strong voice in the international community. And also Brazil is historically a mediator, which is very much necessary today, as we are seeing this like rebranding of a Cold War or a second Cold War between China and the US. I think it's important for different regions to have their own discourse and to have their own point of view about what is happening globally, because I think Latin America is big, strong, and important enough to hold their own into this conversation, and not necessarily just being seen as a proxy ally to the China interest in Latin America.
Absolutely. I mean, I was interested to hear your analysis on this because I know you have a deeper understanding of Brazil than myself. But that's so interesting that Lula came out of jail sort of with that attitude. I mean, it makes sense. Like there was a learning experience for Hugo Chavez in Venezuela as he dealt with the U.S. more and more, he realized the importance of anti-imperialism and establishing Venezuelan independence. And some of the things Lula said at this speech, like Brazil is reconnecting itself with the region and with the world. He said Brazil is back, so really wanting to assert themselves on the global stage, not in the way that the U.S. asserts themselves with imperialism, but as an important country in global trade.
Yeah. And also he was very very strong in his speech. Like he stated some facts which are obvious to everyone, but I think it's also important for them to be said at the UN. He said, like the 1%, which are the wealthiest people on earth, have more money than 40% of the population. He said like a huge percentage of the population of the world don't know what they're going to have for dinner tonight, and they don't know if they're going to be able to afford breakfast tomorrow. Like at the same time, he then again pointed out the extreme injustice and inequality that is a natural production of the current capitalist model, economic social formation. But it's important for us to hear this at the UN, because normally what we hear is this woke progressive discourse about, metaphysical abstract notions of justice and inclusivity and bringing people together under flags that we don't really identify, but leaving outside of the discourse the real problems, the material conditions that produce all this pain, hurt, antagonism, and the crisis that we're seeing now again and again. And then again, something else that was important to me is that Petro, the president of Colombia, he pushed back on the notion of helping Ukraine, and he said, like, if you guys don't remember, just a couple of decades ago, we were the ones being invaded. Like you mentioned, like all the interventions from the CIA and the Condor operation in Latin America, like all the times the US has meddled with the internal politics of Latin America, we were the ones being invaded. And now you come to lecture us about protecting the invaders. What is this? What is this hypocrisy?
Yeah, it's so fascinating that Petro would say that too, considering the role that the U.S. has had in funding and arming paramilitaries in Colombia. Yeah. Very similar to the ethno-nationalist far-right paramilitaries that they funded in Ukraine.
Exactly.
That kept Colombia as basically not completely a U.S. outpost, but their huge U.S. military presence in Colombia and U.S.-backed right-wing paramilitaries there, and pretty much the same thing they started doing in Ukraine pre-2014. Yeah, it's fantastic to hear him point out the hypocrisy. And something else I liked was that Lula condemned the embargo on Cuba, which, like you said, perfect thing to bring up at the UN, where you have all these countries giving flowery, woke rhetoric about coming together and global justice, while the U.S. is holding a criminal, murderous embargo on the island nation of Cuba.
Absolutely. Cuba and Venezuela, like the what they have suffered because of these unilateral, illegal, like inhuman embargoes, it's insane. I think we're going to probably look back at this time in history with much regret and cringe and like absolute shame about what the U.S. has done to these countries with the embargoes, which were killing and costing the life and mobilization of unwanted migrants for such a very long period of time. And then something else that was interesting is that Zelensky was in the crowd. And, Zelensky and Lula have already had a couple of awkward weeks dating, because Zelensky was hunting Lula in the previous weeks because he wanted a meeting with Brazil. He was asking for missiles, and he was asking for military support as well. And Lula was just like ghosting him and not replying to his calls, and like being this toxic one-night stand, not taking the bait. But then here it became unavoidable. So two things that happened that was interesting is that Lula's discourse, like Lula's speech, was interrupted 6 times with standing ovations. 6 times. And this was already a record within that meeting of the UN that year. And Zelensky did not take the blame, or did not take the effort, did not make the effort to applaud a single time during Lula's speech. Like, it was a very, very straightforward ideological position not to applaud Lula. And then after that, since Lula discovered this, he tried to cancel the meeting with Zelensky the next day by saying that he had back pain and stuff like that. He was already on the way to the airport, and I don't know why, and we will see as it will unfold in the next few weeks. He actually took a car back to New York and got a meeting with Zelensky for half an hour. So they discussed. We don't know exactly what, but they discussed. And then Zelensky, when he gave the speech, the room was half empty. They tried, I don't know if you saw, but they tried to fix the video with a full crowd, and Zelensky was also in the crowd. So this was very impressive for him to be giving a speech and applauding his own speech at the same time. And it was very impressive.
Truly incredible. I did see that. That's wild. I saw U.S. media was reporting on Lula's meeting with Zelensky, and I didn't know the context behind it, because that's interesting, because they're trying to pitch it as, look, Lula's now giving support for Ukraine. So hearing the context is interesting.
No. Lula has been ghosting Zelensky for quite a while now, but I don't know why it became unavoidable. But let's see. I think in a way, if we are straightforward and if we are honest about this, and this is the last part of the conversation about the UN, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, he actually wants to sit down and have a negotiation with Ukraine, but the US doesn't let Ukraine negotiate a peace treaty. Like this is out of the table, not because Ukraine wants it or not. The US doesn't want this proxy war to stop. So maybe Brazil's participation, since I don't see China being able to do this because the potential conflict with Taiwan is too close and is too similar. So if China positions itself openly internationally in relationship to self-determination of the people versus invasion, like it will be, let's say, self-condemning in the near future. That's why I don't think China can really open their mouth about their contacts between Russia and Ukraine. But maybe now that Brazil is back, that Lula is empowered again, that Itamaraty is doing an amazing job at geopolitics again, maybe Brazil could act as the potential mediator between Russia and Ukraine.
That's really interesting. I totally agree with your analysis on why China's not able to openly try and broker a peace deal. And if Brazil could step up into that position, it'd be fantastic. And I mean, a lot of Americans don't even know what I think is probably the most important news story out of the Ukraine conflict recently, that there was a peace agreement on the table, and NATO and Boris Johnson and the US pressured Zelensky to drop it and said, no, that would be appeasing Putin. We need to keep fighting and Ukrainians need to keep dying. So, yeah, if Brazil could step in and broker a peace agreement, it'd be an incredible thing for the world.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a very tragic ending for Ukraine. Like I have the people of Ukraine have my sympathy. I have some friends that are actually escaping from the war, and they're currently living in the U.S. and some of them in Mexico, and you can see they're suffering, and it's a true pity because like most of the people in the region of Donbass and in the region of the border with Russia, they speak Russian. Some of them even identify as Russians. If you do a democratic votation, they will probably join Russia. But then again, and this is the question I wanted to ask you. So how do you think the U.S. is going to keep playing this role, if they can, and how they will adapt to the changing situation of being the global arbiter of justice? Like the rule of law. How do you think the rule of law is going to be shaped or used or changed in the next few years?
It's a good question. I mean, I think it's most likely that once this conflict comes to an end, the U.S. will pivot towards China and start targeting them. I mean, NATO had a summit in 2021 or 2022 where they said that their main targets going forward are Russia and China. But I mean, bourgeois international law has always been utilized to help Western interests. Right? It's been designed basically by Western corporations and by Western interests. And, the U.S. uses international law or protecting global norms as justification for a lot of their interventions. So will they try and use that to launch a war with China to say, look, the international norms are changing. International law is no longer benefiting us. So we need to start this drastic sort of nuclear conflict with China and Russia. I hope not. But with the psychotic neocons who are running the American government, I don't know. They just, at the Pentagon, they cleaned house. There were a lot of people coming forward and, saying maybe we should back off here in Ukraine. Maybe we're pushing ourselves too close to the brink of nuclear warfare. And a lot of those people got fired while Victoria Nuland was promoted, who's been leading up the proxy war in Ukraine, helped orchestrate the coup in 2014. So, it's scary times, but it remains to be seen.
Victoria Nuland is one of the riders of the apocalypse. It's insane. That woman, it's a nightmare. It's crazy. So leading like a second part of that question for you, Eddie. So which one do you think is going to crack first, like the ways we are seeing things? It's Europe. It's like the UE, the European Union is going to go under in a way. Like we see Germany is in trouble. Belgium is in trouble. Like the Países Bajos, like Holland is in trouble. Like we see already a lot of European countries, the strong ones, really, really struggling economically. And we're just starting to see the end of the winter, the beginning of the winter. And Russia already are setting prices for fuel and for gas that is going to heavily affect Europe during the winter. So it's either Europe going to go under first, or like the US, because like how fast China is getting rid of all the debt from the US that they bought. and also that to keep wars is very expensive, eh? And I think the war in Taiwan is, if people think that the war in Ukraine is expensive, they have no idea how expensive a proxy war in Taiwan would be regarding the sizes.
Absolutely. And the U.S. is already spending an insane amount of money to try and establish military in the South China Sea and push Australia and the UK towards helping them, because Australia is the closest ally the
Sure.
U.S. even has. But I mean, it's been astounding watching the EU countries go against their own interests, and even sometimes the own interests of their capitalist classes. Seeing them say nothing about the sabotage of Nord Stream and going along with the U.S.'s sanctions on Russia that are destroying their own economies. I got to imagine something's going to give there first in Europe. That would be my guess, because obviously they're much closer to Russia. They were reliant on Russia for energy and for trade much more than the U.S. But at the same time, I don't know. The situation could change, and it could be the U.S. who's the first to collapse or the first to have some kind of political crisis because of this. And what's interesting is now the NATO countries, because they don't have much productive base anymore, or what they used to, and they become financialized, they're running out of ammo and they're running out of munitions. And I don't know how long they're going to be able to keep these endless wars going. So that could have domestic implications for sure. Like you said, BRICS is going to have huge implications for the U.S. I mean, if the U.S. dollar fails, then I think it'll be the U.S. first. But right now, it looks like the European countries. But
yeah, might be more vulnerable, right? Yeah, it's insane, because what most people don't think is that, well, you can have a certain degree of nationalism fueling the passion behind soldiers, but they want to get paid, and they're expensive. And we have to think that the U.S. Army is the largest employer in the U.S. Like the largest, if you see it as a company of it kind of is, like the U.S. Army is the largest employer of the U.S. They employ way too many people, so it's highly expensive to keep that people working for the military interest of the American government. So in that sense, running out of money, or even if the money loses power, it can be like unsustainable super quickly. Like this can change super quickly. Let's say, because in a way, what helps the dollar have power is that everybody needs dollars to trade. So there's a high demand for dollars internationally. So the US can take advantage of that and print as many dollars as they want, because there's demand. So if they're the only supplier of dollars, they can, like Eddie said, they can make the business model or the economic model completely financialized without being actually productive or competitive. But as soon as the world stop asking for dollars, then the dollars are going to come back to the US. And you guys can be flooded with low value dollars rather quickly. And then, like acquisitive power collapses, internal demand collapses. There's no recycling mechanisms for the economies, and there's no high taxation. So suddenly you're going to see an absurd income of return of dollars back to the mainland, and nobody wants those dollars. So out of nowhere, the US can be into highly financial crisis.
And yes, and there's already so much discontent with the economy here in the U.S. And I'd like to add, you said the military is the largest employer. They're also the largest provider of healthcare.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, if the VA is no longer able to provide healthcare, that's 16.2 million veterans in America who are going to be, in an extremely precarious situation. And that's going to have huge political implications. I mean, people are already sick of it. And what's weird is you're seeing it on, what's considered in the U.S., at least the right and the left. You're seeing it from working people of all sides. And a lot of them, sometimes I think they have misplaced anger, but a lot of them recognize that the government is corrupt and the government is not looking out for our best interests. And if an economic collapse comes, I think a lot of people will blame the government, and there will be huge political implications and probably uprisings that come from that. My only concern is that the uprisings won't have a socialist character. They'll probably be more just
reactionary
mass anger. But
yeah, for me, what is always surprising about these moments in history is, I'm kind of jealous, to be honest with you, in some way. How is the right or conservatives or reactionaries able to capitalize on the anger of the working class and actually blame the government and provide the notion of anarcho-capitalism as a viable solution. You know, how oh my god, like they're let's say they're so good with propaganda. They're so propaganda savvy. It's insane because they're able to transform our hate and discomfort with the current working conditions or material conditions, and they transform that into hate for the government, and they make the government smaller. It's insane. It's insanity.
It is, but I mean that's what's taken over the Republican Party in America is faux populism. Rhetoric about helping the working class and ending the wars, and then they don't do it. And there's all these libertarians who recognize the government is corrupt, but they don't realize who owns the government. The capitalist class. That's the root of the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So going to the last one, and I think we left one of the best ones to last. So recently, two things happened, and I think they're highly connected. It's a senator, Bob Menendez. Yeah,
Democratic senator.
Okay, so if you want to introduce the history, I think you can do it better than me.
Sure, yeah, he's a Democratic senator, and he has led up this committee on Cuba that has labeled Cuba as a terrorist state, labeled Cuba as corrupt, done all these things, and said we cannot alleviate the embargo. He's been one of the main senators spearheading the illegal criminal embargo on the people of Cuba. But recently, he was caught in this huge corruption case, and I believe it was Egypt. His house was raided, and he was taking huge stacks of cash, and he even had huge lumps of gold, which he's now admitted were just for personal use, for personal spending. And of course, that's a government that has had a lot of human rights abuses, a lot of things that, if they were happening in Cuba, he would freak out about it and say, see, this is why we need the embargo. So it just shows the hypocrisy that this is the guy leading up the embargo against Cuba, calling them a terrorist state, while he's corrupt and taking money and gold from a country that's far more authoritarian than Cuba's ever been.
Oh, that's crazy. And correct me if I'm wrong, isn't Menendez of Cuban heritage?
I believe he is. He's what we would call a gusano.
Yeah. So I think that's a key point of interest for me, for us to, let's say, connect the dots in this piece of news, which I think it's perfect for us to end up. In a way, first is the logic of embargoes, right? So people have to come up to the conclusion of why did embargoes took place in the first place? Right? Because people, the US is saying we don't want authoritarian regimes to take place in Latin America, so we're going to put an embargo as a soft power measure, not to initiate a war, in order to tear down the violence. But also at the same time, they say they don't want a socialist government to be in power because socialism doesn't work. Okay, so they have to choose one of the two. Either socialism doesn't work, or we need to stop socialism with embargo. Because if you say both, you're very dumb. And if you as a listener, if you believe both, then you are dumb. Like you cannot say that. Either socialism is unviable, like von Mises saying, like, the fatal arrogance of the socialist calculation, which is a very stupid book that I read, and I promised myself never to read again. But I think it's mandatory as a Marxist that we should at least understand why they criticize us. So yes, the socialist calculation is not only viable, but it's still present. And every company on earth makes calculation on demand. It's called forecast. We do forecast all the time. We are planning the economies all the time, every day. And today, artificial intelligence is planning the economy. So we live in planned economies. The difference is that the planned economies are working into the interest of capital and not into the interest of human being. That is the fundamental difference. That is what Deng Xiaoping meant when he said that it doesn't matter if the cat is white or black, as long as it is hunting mice. So that is the difference between how we take place into planned economies. So we know socialism is not only viable, but desirable. So clearly what they're doing with the embargoes is that they're transforming something that is viable and desirable into a public nightmare. And they're instrumentalizing this public nightmare as a recurring propaganda, almost as a piece of advertisement to sell people out of this notion that there are alternatives to socio-economical formations and that they are desirable and they're probably better than what we have seen so far.
Absolutely. And that's why I think it's so important for the U.S. to keep the embargo on Cuba, because they're in the Western Hemisphere. They're right under our nose. So if people see that socialism doesn't fail every time it's tried, that it does work, the U.S. loses a big propaganda point. But like you said, if socialism fails every time, why do you need an embargo? Why can't you just let it fail? But that's always been what they've done, and the context behind that is the Bretton Woods system that was set up post World War II with the IMF and World Bank founded in 1945 or 44. But that's given the U.S. unprecedented power financially on the global stage, and there are thousands of subsidiary banks that come off of that. So it's very difficult for countries who overthrow their capitalist class to survive and advance their productive forces with that U.S. dominated global financial system that then cuts them off from financing and trade. And that's why what China's doing with BRICS and forming these trade partnerships based on mutual development and complete non-interventionism is such a brilliant counter to what the U.S. has done for years with the global financial system.
I agree 100%, Eddie. And also, like, the cherry on the cake is that the guy that is the gusano trader of his own patria, it's now proved to be an unjust, unfair, lying scumbag, like corrupt. Of course, and it only makes sense. I think in the way you have to be this self-centered, narcissistic, egoistic trader in order to be evil enough to betray your own people, your own community, in the interest of somebody else. You know, like this is like the perfect conclusion to what type of people will actually advocate for the continuance of an embargo that is just imposing pain, violence, and suffering on people that have absolutely no need for that type of behavior.
That's true. We like to say at Midwestern Marx, the propaganda from capitalists is always projection from capitalist imperialists.
Yeah.
Like all the things Bob Menendez has said about Cuba, how corrupt they are, it's all true about him. And his daughter is in MSNBC. She's an MSNBC host. So then you see, like, you know, the oligarchic state of the U.S. where we have legacy or political legacies running the media, running the politics, which is what they tell us Cuba is like.
Yeah, I love the sentence. What was it? Everything the capitalists criticize about other people is a projection of themselves?
Yes.
Well, you see, like, for example, communism killed 100 million people, is what the British Empire killed in India only. No, like 100 million Indians out of famines. You know, and then they will say stuff like, you know, like, they're doing proxy wars to gain power, like Hillary Clinton on her last interview criticizing Putin. It's exactly what the U.S. is doing. It's insane. The projection is just out of control.
Exactly. I mean, there was even a leaked CIA document or a CIA officer a while back who said when the Soviet Union was rising and the Cold War was kicking off, we need to accuse the Soviet Union of doing imperialism, so we can take people criticizing us or get them off our backs. You know, it's Soviet imperialism we're combating. It's not the Soviets combating American imperialism. It's projection.
Yeah, it's crazy. You see the seed of the other. And then very much connected, we had an attack on the Cuban embassy in DC. And also the Cuban president was walking on the streets in New York, and he got a very, very nice reception from the Cubans in the US.
Yeah. Our friend of Midwestern Marx, Kala Walsh is her name, and her group were putting together these anti-blockade protests. They had a protest in New York that Diaz-Canel was actually at, the Cuban president, and it was in that context of all these anti-blockade protests that the embassy in DC was hit with Molotov cocktails. So there's still there are a ton of right-wing Cuban people who fled after the revolution, whose families are still in the U.S., especially in Miami. The people that we call gusanos or worms or traitors to their own country. But there were also a lot of them who showed up at the Capitol riots, coincidentally. So
yeah. It's interesting, you know, like this psychological warfare aspect of Cubans and also Venezuelans to a certain extent, that they have to, every time they migrate out of the country, they have to ideologically, like, not only betray, but abandon nationalism completely. You know, like it's a type of Stockholm syndrome. You have to fall in love with your perpetrator. You have to fall in love with the one that is torturing you. Because in a way, you recognize a higher power and you believe that your life is in the hands of this higher power. But since he hasn't killed you yet, he must love you. So, like, you create this negative relationship of love that I recognize the U.S. is powerful. I recognize that the U.S. can kill me at any moment. The U.S. hasn't killed me, so he must love me. So then it's insane. It was explained by Freud that like a century ago. But it's insane that people like they get out of their countries, they abandon completely everything behind, and they become the most vocal advocates like against their own interests, which is for me is insanity. Is like the epitome of the victory of propaganda, because like the peoples that are the suffering, the torture and the violence, they ask for more, like they say, yes, we need harder embargo and more policies and invasion and war. And it's like, my God, what happened to these people?
Right. That was part of the reason Trump said he was going to keep, because Obama alleviated the embargo on Cuba, which Cuba's economy skyrocketed after that. It was partially because the Pope pressured Obama to do it. And Trump said he was going to maintain the Obama era policy until all of those Cuban exiles in Mexico said, no, we're not going to vote for you unless you put the embargo back on. So advocating for their home country to be starved. And I really like the explanation you give with Freud there, because people ask me this all the time. Why are there so many people from Cuba who condemn their own country? And I mean, you have the ones who are being paid by think tanks and stuff who make a lot of money for doing it. But and obviously you get social validation here in the U.S. if you spread anti-communist stuff and say, oh, yeah, I'm from Cuba, it was terrible. But I think the explanation you gave, the psychological explanation, adds a dimension to that explanation and helps us understand why it happens. But it is, I mean, gusano is a perfect word. Worm is a perfect word. Someone who leaves their own country and then advocates for it to be destroyed.
Yeah, feed on the body of the dead and the dirt of the others. It's insane. I think this is highly complicated, because in a way, every time I see news about Venezuela and Cuba, it's like I'm seeing advertisement. Like it's completely manufacturing consent in the very true root Chomskyan way of building a set of beliefs that is able to explain and is also filtered through the outlets of power that provide the right angle for the news to address the people. And it's just like you said, there's a lot of social validation as well. Like you can go on the streets and you say you hate authoritarian governments in Central America, and people will applaud you like seals. It's insane.
Absolutely. And there was like what you bring up about the media when they talk about Venezuela and Cuba, because one of the things they accuse Venezuela and Cuba of, and this goes back to how it's all projection, is having a muzzled media, having propaganda media. And there was a study by an excellent media watchdog outlet called fair.org that found every single mainstream media outlet in the U.S. is in favor of regime change in Venezuela. So you want to talk about a muzzled media or a hegemonic media? Our media is hegemonically advocating for overthrowing democratically elected governments. I mean, there's no country with a more cohesive propaganda apparatus than
the
that.
U.S. Yeah, I mean, the CNN and Fox News, they both belong to Vanguard, State Street, and BlackRock.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, you can say one of them is left and one of them is right, one of them is Republican, the other is Democrat. They're both capitalists. Like it doesn't really matter at all in the end. And another aspect that was interesting hearing to your last idea is that they say, okay, so let's say you have freedom of worship in your country, but everybody is a Catholic, right? Then it means that your freedom is limited by non-legislative aspects. So either social, ideological, cultural, economical. So you can be free. There's an illusion of freedom, but there's no material freedom for you to exercise your freedom of worship. So yes, you can be Muslim in the US, but you're going to suffer harassment, discrimination. You're going to be attacked on the street. You're not going to be invited to some businesses and whatnot. So it's the same thing with news. I mean, you have freedom of expression, but your sponsors only allow you to support one side of the story. Otherwise, they don't advertise you. Then you're not really free to express your point of view. You see, there's no real practical freedom. There's only metaphysical possibility of freedom, but there's no actual freedom in the material world.
Absolutely. And that's one of the points that Michael Parenti makes in his book, Inventing Reality, or Chomsky and Herman and Manufacturing Consent is, yeah, a lot of Americans think maybe we have freedom of press, or they have in the past thought that because, it's written into the Constitution and maybe the media apparatuses aren't owned by the state or owned by the government, but corporations can still do propaganda. And in fact, those corporations aren't going to hire anybody who's critical of them, anybody who goes against their interests, anybody who speaks out against imperialism. You're simply not getting hired. And if you start criticizing imperialism after you've already established yourself in corporate media, you're fired. Even I mean, Tucker Carlson, as many criticisms as I have of him, he started criticizing the proxy war in Ukraine, and Fox News fired him, even though he was the most popular show, not even just for Fox News, but in the country.
Oh yeah,
He brought
easily.
in more ratings than anyone. They fired him.
Yeah, he was a potential candidate, which then again go back to my point that we're all very much very beautiful, sensual, beautiful, but highly disposable human capital. Like even Tucker Carlson is disposable for the system. This is what is interesting. It's weird to think that even somebody as Elon Musk is disposable. In the end, the system itself is going to find a level of autopoiesis, like a systematic sustainability and self-perpetuation, that all actors within the system are highly replaceable. Every single one of them, even presidents, like news anchor, no matter how powerful you are, you are replaceable, because the will of the system is the perpetuation of the system itself. The system is acting out in the will of the people. It's not acting out the will of the people. It's acting out in the will of the people. But then again, that's another story for another day. My friend Eddie, where can people find you? Can you talk to us a little bit about the work in Midwestern Marx Institute?
For sure, yes. We're an institute for political theory, education, and geopolitical analysis based in the Midwestern United States, which is traditionally not a place where Marxism and communism have flourished, but that is starting to change as economic conditions deteriorate and as more people open their eyes to imperialism. So our biggest thing is focusing on ideological and theoretical education and keeping people up to date on imperialism and geopolitics. The Midwestern Marx YouTube is where we're extremely active. We do streams 2-3 times a week at least. MidwesternMarx.com is our website, and you can also find us on Twitter and Instagram, and then on TikTok as well. Edward M. Liger is the name of the Midwestern Marx TikTok. I've got another one called Ed B. Liger because we've been banned 7 times from TikTok.
Crazy.
So we're back up to like 50,000 followers or something on those 2 accounts. So if you like the short form videos or you like the TikTok app, we're pretty active on there. So and thank you so much for having me on. I love doing this show.
No, come on, man. It's my pleasure. Anytime. And if you ever want me to go with you guys and have a conversation on the stream, whatever, I'm up to it. Just let me know in time and I will be there.
For sure. We would love that.
Yeah. Send my regards to Noah, to Carlos, and to the rest of the team. I know they're pretty cool guys as well. I would love to have a conversation with them. Y ahora sí, a mis queridos, hermosos y sensuales capitales humanos que están aquí hasta el final, gracias por la paciencia. Ustedes saben que parte también del objetivo del canal es entablar estas conversaciones con diferentes figuras y pensadores prominentes del pensamiento materialista de otros países. Y pues, obviamente, Eddie, not only a brilliant thinker of Marxism, but also in the belly of the beast. So it's important that we establish a very cool relationship, because we need to understand the current geopolitical position that we're in order to make the right choices and actually see beyond the veil of propaganda to what's really going on.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Amén. Abrazo, camarada.